Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about, let me fix my chair. I'm sorry. The girls, what they do is they play in the chair. So mainly it's sweets. But she lays down in the chair, pulls the handle, and takes the elevator down. But anyway, it's early in the morning. I want to talk about Seattle's whole upzone situation. Seattle is, and this has been the discussion for quite some time, and they've done already some upzone areas. And if you don't know what upzoning is, it's basically converting areas, or actually rezoning areas that are for single-family homes, and making it where they can be multi-story buildings. If you don't know, you can't put an apartment building just anywhere in most cities. It has to be zoned for high density, right? So even if it's a residential area, it has to be zoned for high density or multi-purpose residential, okay? So multi-purpose residential allows for you to have what you see as a mixed unit. So you have retail down below on the bottom floor, so ground level, and then you have apartments on the top, or it could be that you have a mixture of retail, hotel, office, residential. So it just depends on how it's actually done, and each one of those requires permission from the city in terms of when you are going to develop. And obviously, if it's a single family area, doesn't matter how you propose it, the planning commission's typically going to deny it. Now, the city of Seattle is facing a housing affordability issue. Now, this is something that's been talked about quite a bit, and I had mentioned before what the city does in terms of its affordable housing. We talked about Yesler Terrace, and I will include Yesler Terrace, that video, actually in the description box down below. But there's two things that developers now have to do, okay? When they're developing a residential development, they have to either set aside a certain percentage of the units to be affordable units. So this means that it's a subsidy. They have to basically take a hit and not allow those apartments to be at market rate. Now, market rate means that a developer can set the price, right? So whatever the market can absorb, the developer will set that price. So that doesn't mean that, you know, just because a one-bedroom unit in this building is $2,000, that next door, that one-bedroom unit might be $1,800, right? So they're going to be different depending upon what the developer says that they feel the market will be able to absorb. When we're talking about under that, where basically the city says make it affordable, it's no longer on this float where a developer can just set whatever the price is. It's going to be at a certain percentage that will align with people's incomes, right? So, and what they're talking about are folks who are pretty much making minimum wage, or, you know, less than, I don't know, so many $1,000s a year, right? So they do that so that they can actually have more and more people who are able to have a place to live, and that once you do that, less services are going to have to be offered. When you have homelessness, there's a lot of other things that come with that. Some people think that just because a person's homeless, it costs the city nothing, and that's just not true, because you have a lot of things that have to go into that. When you have a homeless person, you have to have city services to check up on them. So that means that you have a team of police officers who have to go around. Now, this is if everything is, you know, there's no crimes being committed. You have to have a police officer going around with social workers to check on the homeless folks that are out there. The various different little camps that are out there, that happens all the time. If someone were to get hurt, cut, beat up, or whatever, then you also have to deal with the medical aspects of that, right? Not to mention any sort of substance abuse or anything like that. So it's a very expensive thing. So a lot of times what cities like Tacoma and others are figuring out is if you provide housing, then you can take away some of those particular issues. You're still going to have some, but if you actually start to have folks working and off of substance and different things, then you're able to kind of stamp out a lot of the homelessness. Well, A lot of the people that you see in Seattle are not necessarily due to substance abuse or anything like that in terms of homelessness. It's just due to affordability. And that's actually an issue that's affecting folks down in Tacoma, really this entire region. So Seattle says either you can set aside a certain amount of apartments for the folks that can't really, they're not homeless, but they can't really afford market rate apartments, or you have to pay into a housing fund, right? So many dollars per square foot that you build. So if you build 100 square feet of residential space or a project that is that big, you have to pay so many dollars per square foot to the city. So it's basically a fee you have to pay to the city of Seattle when you're developing. So then you can set it at whatever market rate you want, but you're having to pay that fee. So it's either one of the options, right? Now this does not affect properties that are, you know, grandfathered in. So old properties that have been around for a while, that is not into play. It's only new builds. And so the city feels that this is the way to go, because they're able to then take the money from that fee and basically either build their own projects that not project. I don't want people to think that, but build their own development that handles any sort of housing, or they can offer subsidies to property owners and say, look, you know, we know that you have properties, we're willing to subsidize that rent. So let's say I have a property that is $2,500 a month. The tenants can't afford that, but they can afford $1,000 a month. So the city may issue some subsidies in there to help offset that. That's just a very bad example, but that's kind of generally how it works. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a building that they build or that they construct. They also work with property owners around the area to kind of subsidize the living for folks. So that's kind of how that whole entire program works. One of the other things that the city of Seattle is trying to do that Tacoma doesn't really have to worry about just yet, and where I think Seattle's going to have a problem, is the whole upzoning situation. Upzoning means that they build up. And so instead of having a whole area where it's a bunch of single-family homes, anytime there's a vacant lot due to whatever, if there's a fire that, you know, the house is no longer there, or an old building that is not really in use or something like that. You see a lot of buildings that used to be a tire shop or whatever the case may be. A developer can knock that down and actually build a small apartment building. Now, most of the time, these lots are very small. We're talking like an acre or less. But in most cases, many cities will say that's not a big enough piece of land for you to build multi-space. I mean, there's the size of land, and this is even in the rural parts of the country, no matter where you are. Depending upon the size of land, depends on how many houses you can actually have, right? Like where I'm from, you can have 3 houses on an acre, you know? So you're able to do that. And other places, you can have probably more than that. It just depends on the sewer system, the infrastructure, and all that type of stuff. All of those things come into play when you're actually building a home. It may be less than 3. It depends on the site, the square footage, and all that stuff. There's a whole parameter, but it depends on what cities require and their planning commissions and all that type of stuff, and the infrastructure and all of that, if it can handle it. Well, in cities, most of those things in terms of infrastructure is not an issue. You have city sewer, city water, power can handle it, the roads typically are able to handle it, so they're able to build up. And the idea is if we allow them to build up, they're going to be able to put in more people into housing, right? And we're talking affordable housing. They feel that if they allow for upzoning, in some of these residential areas where the lots are a little bit more affordable to buy to begin with. Keep in mind, lot prices are going to vary depending upon the zone that it's in. So a commercial zoned lot that's empty is going to cost a whole lot more money than an empty residential lot. Because with a commercial lot, you can build anything on it. You can build, you know, a hotel or a store. So those lots are going to go more than a residential lot. So the idea, and a single family residential lot's going to go a lot more affordably than it would be for a lot that's zoned for high density residential. So if we can sell it to developers at the price that you and I would pay for a lot, that lowers their overall cost to begin with. Then if they build up, the idea is the savings that they save on this should be passed off to the consumer, and it can help solve a lot of the housing affordability issues. Now, some folks were chiming in and having their own discussion down below, and some of it was very, very important. And they were addressing two issues that are very core. Well, one issue that's very core in Seattle, and that's parking. People were saying, that's cool, you've already done some upzoning in different areas of the city already, University District area, Chinatown, there's another area, I can't remember. You're doing the upzoning there, you've identified over a dozen, almost 24 places where you want to do this upzoning in different neighborhoods, meaning that if it happened down here, if there was a lot next door that was empty, that could be a multi-story building. Now, we're not talking 40 stories or 20 stories, we're talking something that's probably a mid-rise level, so we're talking 6 stories or less, maybe 8. And so they're saying, what about parking? Well, a lot of the rules in the upzoning allows for them to basically, they don't have to provide parking. And I'm not sure, I think that Seattle may be this way, I can't remember now, because different cities are different, but I don't think you have to provide parking in most places in Seattle, I think. I can't remember. I know downtowns you don't, but I'm not sure if that's the case for all of Seattle now. I don't think parking has to be required for a developer, not even on a percentage level. So that's kind of the issue that people have. Other folks were saying, why not have the entire city upzoned to at least 3 stories? Because if a building is 3 stories, you don't have to provide an elevator. Elevators add a tremendous amount of cost to a building because you have to have permits to install an elevator. Then you have the wiring systems that go for an elevator. You then have to deal with the cost of the actual elevator itself, the continued maintenance of the building. And so you run into a lot more costs. So that is passed on to the resident. So a lot of folks are saying, why not a 3-level building all over the city? And you could probably satisfy the issue. Here's my take on all of it. I don't think that developers are I don't think you're going to solve affordable housing necessarily by just upzoning. I think that what's going to happen is that you're going to allow upzoning to happen, but developers are going to look at it from the standpoint that you're still building in Seattle. Seattle has an apartment glut, but these are luxury apartments typically. And if they're not luxury, they're near luxury levels, meaning that most of these apartments have bells and whistles and all the pretty, and so you're paying for that, even though the apartment building that doesn't have the bells and whistles costs about the same when you're building it. It's just that they make it look really pretty. You can make something look really, really nice, and it doesn't cost much more than something that looks basic. But anyway, that's not the point. So the problem is that you're still going to run into the issues with the cost of land. Because the land prices, even though some of these are going to be where single-family homes are, you can basically afford those at a much cheaper rate. The problem is not all of these are going to be the case. When you look at places like Chinatown, most of that is not zoned as residential. Just single family. So in that case, they were still developing. They were allowed to build up higher, but these were in places that are already zoned for high density or commercial or something like that. So it's still expensive to buy the land, and it's selling at market rates. The only thing that's changing is that instead of being at a cap that you can only build it to 8 stories, you can now build it up to 20 or so stories. The problem is that you're still having to pay a lot for the land. And again, as you go up in height, you're going to generally be paying more money to build because you have to have more infrastructure to the project to actually do that. Hold on one second. Okay, I'm back. I had to blow my nose, man. I know that's gross, but in the morning times I'm all nasally and allergies and all that stuff. But anyway, so I'm good now. So you have to spend more money because once you get up to a certain height, and again, the person who made this comment may be a small developer, but a 3-story building, the infrastructure for that's not that detailed, really. You know, you're not putting, there's not a lot of weight pushing down on the ground. When you start to go up a little bit higher than that, you have to start digging under the ground a little bit more and building up that entire surface. So it costs a whole lot more money because there's more weight, obviously. This physics. More weight's pushing down. So in order, especially given the soil conditions here and the weather that we have, you have to make sure that you either put pylons into the ground or something into the ground that's going to be able to absorb that weight. So the higher up you go, the more infrastructure you have to put into the ground, and you're adding astronomical prices. That's where we're at with a lot of these upzone areas. I don't know if that's going to really address the affordability issue. I think what you're doing is giving developers a little bit of a break because some of these areas are away from the downtown core, so the prices are a little bit cheaper in terms of buying, but you're still going to be able to charge rents that are not, it's not going to make much of a difference for folks, right? What they're trying to do is get the rents down to a certain levels of what you see here in Tacoma, and I don't see that happening. Tacoma has the issue of getting developers here because the cost to build here is the same as what it is up in Seattle, but it has to make sense, and so therefore you don't have these big tall buildings that you see in Bellevue and in Seattle, because there the cost is the same as here, but you can get more money for the product. So that's why they're having that. Once everything has an equilibrium, then you're going to see development all over the place. It doesn't matter because they can command a higher rent down here just like they would be able in Bellevue and in Seattle. It's not at that point yet. In those two places, yeah, rents are going, actually it's higher in Bellevue, but they can get the money back. So here it doesn't pay to build up because you have to put so much money into it. When you do that, you are really making a huge commitment. So a mid-level building, not a problem. Once you get too high, it's not going to save you a lot. So the person who made the comment about a 3-story building, or that should be the case all over, makes a lot of sense because you're still having density, quite a bit of density, but you're not putting a whole lot of money into the building, right? So therefore, developers can keep the prices much lower than what would be the case. My take on this is that I don't know if that's going to solve the issue. The 3-story part, I think that's cool, but I don't think the city's going to necessarily do that. I think that probably we should take the approach of what Vancouver has done. Vancouver, Canada, has built up around every one of their SkyTrain stations. Really, Vancouver probably has one of the best transportation systems, I think, in North America. It just is very efficient. It's amazing, to be honest with you. It's really, really, really nice. So Vancouver, they allow for upzoning that occurs right by the transit stations. So build a 40-story building right around the transit stations. And the idea is that you don't have to worry about parking because you're well connected. Unlike Seattle, their transportation network is very well connected. You don't really need a car because the places that you're able to walk to satisfy all of your services needs. You mostly need a train to actually get to work or to sporting events or other lifestyle things, but you don't necessarily need it for things outside of that, right? Because everything else is in your neighborhood. That's kind of the concept. So you build up, you're able to put a lot of people into those particular buildings, and yeah, it costs a lot of money to do that, but you're saving because you don't have to pay for a parking garage. Parking garages are very expensive. You know, to each parking space, when you're developing a parking garage, is at least $100,000 a parking space. So, and it goes up exponentially once you start building up higher. I mean, imagine a bunch of, it's all concrete, big columns pushing down. It's very expensive. And that's why you don't see a lot of them in a lot of places, because it's very expensive. If you go to a small town, you hardly ever see a parking garage, especially one that's over 8 floors, because it's just so pricey. It's extremely expensive, and there has to be some sort of benefit out of it or a critical need. So developers aren't going to want to actually do that nor do they want to dig underground and have underground parking. Someone was saying, why not have underground parking? I need my underground parking, but they don't realize building underground for parking is also very expensive to do. But in Vancouver, a lot of that's been eliminated because the transportation system is so good, it's not really needed. So developers save money even though it costs a lot to build up. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have a housing affordability issue either, because they do. It's pretty bad. They have had prices start to tank recently, and a lot of places in the country have had prices starting to dip down. That's not the case in many places, like Las Vegas and others, that it's going up. But it's starting to go down. Here in Seattle, it's starting to go down. In Tacoma, it's starting to go down just a little bit. And we're seeing that actually shift and change. It could start to go back up in the other direction. You never know. Real estate does fluctuate, and it's based on a lot of different things. So with that said, I don't know if necessarily just the upzoning alone is going to solve it. I think that there's a combination of different things that need to go into place. I think that, one, the city needs to find a much more affordable way to deal with homelessness, which they could look at the Tacoma model, which has been very, very successful. That should tackle a lot of that. Gives the city more money to use for other housing initiatives. I think number two, I think the plan that they're doing as far as charging fees to developers is great. Whether they set aside money for projects or whether they actually set aside apartments for folks with a little bit lower income, I think those are good strategies, because that addresses the affordable housing issue. I think that building up Yesler Terrace is probably going to be the biggest play into this, because the city can really address that and really and truly focus on that. It's a great opportunity. I mean, to be honest with you, it's probably one of the best soundest decisions I think that a city like Seattle can make. But I also think that one of the other things that really and truly should be addressed is building up exponentially near transit stations. There's a lot of opportunity that's been missed in Seattle, where you have stations and they have what's called TOD, or TransitOriented Development. These are basically lots around these transit stations in Seattle, some of them, and this is basically their staging areas. When they build transportation networks, they have to have a staging area. In Tacoma, they're building the extension for the Tacoma Link, and the staging area is miles away from all the activity, which is kind of strange, but it costs a lot of money to have a staging area on land that you have to basically rent from someone to stage it. So I get it. But in Seattle's case, a lot of times Sound Transit owns that land. They basically buy it, and they own the land around there. And so it's right there by the stations. They can move all that stuff into place, have all their heavy equipment, heavy concrete columns, and all of those big subway panels, all of that stuff's on site. It just makes actually designing and building a whole lot faster than having to truck it all in from a distant site. It's just very expensive. So when they're done with the project, they no longer need the land, and so they offer it to developers. The problem is that the city is not pushing for bigger buildings. These are mid-rise buildings that a lot of developers are trying to get away with, because technically Sound Transit sells the land for a discount, because they're trying to encourage development. The problem is developers put a 4-story or 5-story building and it doesn't really hit the mark, right? This is land that's very valuable, and it should be buildings that are much, much taller. Like what you see in Vancouver. You can literally look at the skyline outside of their downtown, and you can see these columns of buildings, and just a column of buildings, nothing but low rises, a column of buildings, and you can tell where stations are just by looking at the columns of buildings. That's not always the case, but you see a lot of areas like that. That's what should happen here, and I think you will slowly, with all these different parameters, lower the problem in terms of affordable housing. It's not just going to be a one-size-fits-all. I think there's a lot of different things that has to be done in order to address it. But anyhow, I think that the whole upzone thing is going to be one that's going to have a lot of heartache, because a lot of folks who have single-family homes don't necessarily want to see an apartment building go up next to them. But really, Seattle doesn't have a whole lot of options, not a lot of land available, and that land is extremely expensive. So let me know what you think. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, I will see you. Take care.